Alrighty then, let's begin painting the penguin's face. I say begin, however, this is actually the 4th time I've tried painting his face. The first 3 times, I tried doing it in oils, which is the same thing that I used on the Batman and the Catwoman, but this time around, just could not get it to work. Part of my inexperience with oil paints, I couldn't get the color tone just right, but also the big difference between the penguin and the other two is there's a lot more wrinkles on this face. Oils are really great for smoothing out over flat surfaces, but trying to keep them out of little folds and wrinkles just proved too difficult for me. So after 3 failed attempts, we're going back to acrylics. Now this is the largest face I've ever painted with acrylics as far as I remember, at least a human face. So what I did, I had to do some research to figure out exactly how to do it right and how it's different from a 28mm face. And rather than looking at figures, what I did is I went and I researched how to paint action figures, if that's the correct term, but like sideshow toys, hot toys, those large 1/6 scale, really expensive figures. There's a whole subculture out there. People will repaint those, make them look a lot more realistic. So followed what they did. I watched several guides and I came up with my own method, somewhat my own method, to try to paint Burgess Meredith here. And so this is kind of a learning guide for me as well as you guys. In fact, I had to redo all the audio to make a little bit more sense out of this, so this took quite a while to get finished. But enough of that, let's just jump in and start painting. Starting off with 3 colors here. This is a tricolor mix of Vallejo Panzer Ace's Flesh Base. That's for the main flesh color. Then to that, I want to lighten up a little bit, so we mixed in a little bit of Vallejo Model Color Basic Skintone. Needed it a bit more red though, so for that I also mixed in a little bit of Vallejo Model Color Rose Brown. After a first few light layers of those 3 colors, I started going back and lightening up the flesh tones a little bit, starting at highlights. I say highlights, actually I was just trying to lighten up the flesh tone completely because I thought it was a bit too dark to start off with. Since we're doing such a large face, we don't need to start with the darkest colors, the dark shade colors like I normally do, and work all the way up to the highlights. We can actually start with the medium tone and then insert the highlights on top of that and insert the shades where they need to, because we have enough space to get a brush in there. So a lot of tweaking with the base color here, just trying to find out what the proper color would be at this point. At this point I started testing some of the shadows, and we're putting in some very, very thin paint. It's the same tricolor that we had before, but now I mixed in some Vallejo Panzer Ace's Shadow Flesh into that, and we're just starting to put some colors into the recesses. Another thing I've added to this mix, and throughout this whole project mostly, is flow aid. I don't normally use a whole lot of flow aid just because I don't really deem it necessary for most 28mm projects. However, I did use quite a bit of it here because it slows down the drying time of the paint incredibly, and actually gives you plenty of mixing time. The downside of that though is it does slow down the drying time, but that means that you can't paint as quickly. Essentially it's so slow that you put on one color, one shade color like this, and they say, okay, I'm done for the evening, I gotta let this whole thing dry. So this is a very slow process, but just putting in this first shade color here right now, kind of spreading out and then smoothing it in with a clean brush as needed. For the next step, I added a very light glaze of Vallejo Game Color Beasty Brown. This seems like an odd thing to do, but as you'll see throughout this whole project, this is all about layers, extremely thin, transparent layers repeated over and over. Why? Because flesh has a lot of characteristics to it, a lot of color characteristics. No one's just like one skin tone. You have light spots, you have dark spots, sometimes a little bit more red to your cheeks, areas like that. And so we're going to be dealing a whole lot of extreme extremely thin transparent layers over and over again. And this just added a little bit more brown to the skin tone, which I thought was needed at this point. At this point, our skin tone's still looking pretty dark, so I went back to my original tricolor mix, added a little bit more basic skin tone, and I'm just putting a very thinned out, basically another glaze, pretty much over everything here. And again, this is all about variation. I am going over the shade areas that I just did, and then I'll go back and I will redo the shade areas, and then I may go back with the base coat again, just to get different slight variations in the skin tone. This isn't quite covering up mistakes. This is lightening up a shaded area slightly and then going back and with that same color and doing the shade color over that. So now that you have a two-tone variation going on. This is what this whole project is, and this is why it's kind of confusing to explain how to do it, because this is just a lot of what seems like mistakes, but it's actually key to what I'm trying to do here is just tons of transparent layers slowly built up so you have slight variations in the skin tone. Still working with our initial tricolor compound here, but this time I have a little bit more of the basic skin tone mixed in, and now we can start working on some highlights. And again, this is very thin paint and then heavily thinned with flow aid, so I'm kind of just blocking it in right now, and then once I have it in place, I'll still spread it around a bit and soften it, basically in the same way that I would if this was oil paint. However, this is a bit more controllable than oil paints. I'm also more familiar with it, so I'm more comfortable working with it. And then this is at the exact same stage. However, I started blending the paints in a bit more here, slowly working them into the previous colors so you can see the change here. Again, this is the exact same skin tone that I did in the previous clip I just mentioned, but now it's been spread out and softened a bit more and blended into the original base coat. I'm starting to work on some of the deeper shaded areas now, and for that I need to mix up a little shade of somewhat purple, and for that, rather than using purple straight out of the bottle, I try to use something closer to the colors I've already been using. So this is a mix of Game Color Shadow Gray, the Panzer Ace's Shadows Flesh that we already used, and then a little bit of Vallejo Model Color Flat Red. And again, this is extremely thin, and it's also heavily thinned with flow aid. So I'm just kind of applying it to the areas where I want a bit of extra shade, around the jawline, around the eyes, a little bit around the ears, and then we're just slowly blending those colors in. And again, if I do too much here, I may go back and I'll reapply our tricolor base color to lighten that area up a bit and then reapply the shade. And again, that's not necessarily fixing mistakes, that's just getting more color variation, color tone into the whole process. One of the key things to remember when you're working on larger scale figures like this, if you come from a background of like 28mm figures like I do, is that the larger the scale, the less contrast you want to add to a figure, because natural light is going to play a part to that. We do still need to have some darker colors on here. I just want to mention that kind of as an FYI. But getting back to the paint here, did need a slightly darker shade for some areas, and for that previous shade color that I used, I've now mixed in a little bit of Vallejo Game Color Charred Brown, which is a very dark brown with slight red tone to it. And mainly this is just going nostril areas, in the ear canal areas, a little bit around the eyes, very subtle small areas. I'm also starting to just darken some of the areas around the hair as well, since I have the color and those need to be darkened. Starting on the eyes now, and on a base coat of beige mixed with a little bit of white, where you're now applying a little spot of Vallejo Game Color Charred Brown, and also using that same color very thin to just add a bit of shade around the eyelids. Burgess Meredith eyes supposedly are light brown. I have found pictures of them with light blue eyes as well. It's film, it's hard to trust, but I'm going with light brown. The eyeball was highlighted with a little bit of flat earth, but it still, from what the photos I've seen, his eyes still pretty dark, so I kept them dark. Also, I think it works well for the penguin look. Now adding some extremely thin Vallejo model color flat red, and just doing a little bit of color on the corners of the eyes, make them a bit more realistic, a little extra detail. Then we could finish off the eyeballs themselves, which is the standard black pupil with a white dot. And I do find it's easier if you do the white dot first because it's a bit more forgiving. Do the white dot in the upper left or upper right hand corner of the eyeball, and then once that's done, you can take a slightly smaller drop of black and then do that in the center of the eyes. The hair is simply black and then white added for the highlights, but starting with the eyebrows, which for the eyebrows I mixed in a bit more white than I did with the rest of the hair on the head, because eyebrows tend to look lighter in color because they're not as thick, so some of the flesh tone is coming through as well. So just trying to do them a little bit lighter and doing lines, you know, the way natural hair would grow out of one's eyebrows, and then just slowly building them up. Personally, I think I probably could have gone a little bit lighter on the eyebrows as well, but I have to tell you what I did and tell you what I should have done. Let you work out which one's better. Next comes the teeth. After applying a little bit of a wash of charred brown just to define them better, I'm going through and painting them with Vallejo model color beige. Now, I probably could have gone a little bit more yellow with this color because I checked after I did the painting, and Burgess Meredith didn't have the best dental care, so making him a little bit more yellow is acceptable. One thing I will mention here, I talk about contrast a lot. Do not put a lot of contrast on teeth. I know doing black lines between teeth looks really good on 28 mil stuff. Don't do it on larger scales because it'll look horrible. And then after doing a solid base coat of beige across all the teeth, I'm going to start picking individual teeth out with a mix of beige and white. Again, if I were to redo this, I would do the teeth a bit more yellow, probably add a little bit of yellow ochre to that initial beige, because his teeth were pretty bad. That's all I gotta say. On to the lips, and for that, going back to some initial colors here, well, at least one initial color, the Rose Brown that we used for the red in the skin tone. I've mixed that with Vallejo model color Cavalry Brown and starting to put in the lips. Don't forget the upper lip as well. Normally, again, small scale figures, you can ignore the upper lip, but you do need a little bit color on the upper lip when you're going to this large of scale. Just don't overdo it because you don't want him to look like he's wearing lipstick. And then to highlight, simply add white to that previous mix and highlight in an up and down fashion so we get that kind of ridge look that most lips have. It also gives a kind of a sheen to it here by adding a little bit of extra white just on the center area of the bottom lip. I almost forgot about his hair. This was painted with black, straight black, and then we're doing highlighting now very subtly with a mix of black, white, and Vallejo game color steel gray, and just kind of picking out some of the highlights on the hair. When applying the hair, you kind of want to do a little jagged line where the hair meets the flesh. You don't want to do a straight line. You want to keep the idea of, loose hairs, kind of hanging off the side, so it's a bit more realistic rather than a straight edge looking like a wig. I probably, on second thought, I probably should have used brown for the highlights, because Burgess Meredith hair apparently was dyed, I don't know with what, for the show, because I believe he had brown hair naturally. So brown would have been a good idea, because that would have implied his natural hair color coming through, rather than going with blue, which would suggest a straight black hair color. At this point, we can go ahead and add his cigarette holder, and I should have test fitted this before painting everything, because it didn't fit that well. I had to actually drill out the hole in the teeth a little bit more, which is kind of scary after you painted everything. But it's painted black. Then there's a little band on it, which is white. However, I went with a beige and white combo just to make it look more like ivory, so it looks different than the cigarette. Cigarette white with a little bit of gray painted on the end, not red. And then we're painting the little ring there gold, and for that I'm using AK Interactive's gold color, which is a wax base, essentially the same as oil paint. And that gives us a good, more realistic gold color, especially in this large scale. At this point, everything's been flat varnished, and then I went back and applied a gloss varnish to the eyes. And now I'm doing a semi-gloss varnish to the teeth and the lips. And when you're doing your gloss varnish on the eyes, at least if you're like me, you might mess up a little bit. I did go back with a brush just around the edges of the eyes, around the eyelids, with a little bit of extra flat varnish just to clean up any of the gloss that might seep in and touch the skin tone. At this point, we're just applying the finishing touches. I would normally wait until the figure was completely finished before doing all this, but just for the sake of completion for this video segment, I wanted to do the entire face. The monocle is in place. I had to paint the edge of the monocle with gold, and then that was glued into place with some silicone sealant. Now I'm adding just a little whiff of smoke to the cigarette. Again, a little drop of silicone sealant on the edge of the cigarette, and then I carefully applied a tiny little wisp of just plain old cotton from a cotton ball. And I'm just trimming it to shape. Don't want it too big, and just kind of fluffing it and shaping it and trimming it as needed until we get the proper shape for the cigarette smoke. And we're done. That is it. After that little bits, we're finally done with our penguin face. After 4 tries, finally got it somewhat correct. A few improvements I could have done. I still think the face probably could be a little bit lighter in skin tone. There's also a bit more variations I could add to it, which is, there's so many different things I could do, and I don't want to do them all on one project, but there are different things I want to try on some of the other figures in the range when I get to them. We'll have to see how that takes shape. Robin's going to be a little bit boring because he's supposed to be a young boy, so there's not going to be a lot of skin variations on him, sunspots, things like that. But maybe when we get to other figures in the range, we can start seeing some of those. But until then, we're done with our penguin, at least the face. Now we got the rest of his body to deal with. See you next time.